Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Real inspiration for real innovators. If you're looking for innovation and leadership transformation, your journey starts now.
Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Born. If you're enjoying these innovation insights, don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss a future episode. By following the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast, you'll stay at the forefront of trends, strategies, and real-world examples that guide today's innovators. And we have a friend of Innovation Meets Leadership back, Ron Crabtree. Not only is he the founder of and CEO of MetaOps and MetaExperts, but he has 30 years of global experience in business process improvement. And so we looked last time at his world from a very high level. And today we're going to dive in a little deeper and we're going to actually focus on something called value stream mapping. And I'm very excited to have Ron back because my hope is you'll go listen to that first episode first. That will give you kind of an overview. And now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the world of value stream mapping. So welcome to the podcast, Ron.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm really glad to be back.
Okay, so many leaders have heard the term value stream mapping. It's a tool in manufacturing, but how would you explain the value of this, of what it is, and how it can actually traverse into other industries as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to tackle that. And, I'm kind of a fan of this guy who's named D. Edwards Deming, who is kind of the father of modern quality. And he said something very profound. He said, basically, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you don't know what you're doing. And that's super powerful, just starting with that value stream mapping is very much a visual technique, but behind it, there's a ton of data and lots of different ways to go after that. So think about this methodology called value stream mapping. There's at least 100 ways to do it. And they're all dictated specifically by the nature of the problems that we need to tackle, right? What kinds of information and granularity of that information is needed to help us get a good enough understanding of the data to make informed decisions about what we can or should be doing differently in any process. And it's kind of back to the Einsteinian, quote of the formulation of the problem is often more essential than the solution. So what's really critical before you pick which method and what level of granularity, which I'll describe what that means here in a bit, the crucial question is, what am I solving for, right? What's the problem as an organization that we're trying to get to? So if you're in manufacturing, for example, when we think about the data we may go after in manufacturing, the great benchmark around value stream mapping in a manufacturing setting is credited to Toyota and a book called Learning to See by Rother and Shook. And I had the privilege of actually working for a large management consulting company, mainly ex-Toyota folks, and we were doing accelerated lean deployment at Ford Motor Company. I had 20 project managers and consultants, mostly from Toyota, and we were doing very in-depth value stream mapping in the assembly plants at Ford. And for Toyota, there's these key metrics, SQDCMP, right? That's safety, quality, delivery, cost, productivity, and morale. In the context of a manufacturing company in the automotive industry, that was the hierarchy of criticality. If it's not safe, it's a non-flyer, right? If it's not good the first time, high quality, it's no good. If it's not on time, it doesn't matter. If we're not effective from a cost perspective, then our competitors will put us out of business. And our productivity is, are we incrementally improving from zero base to better performance at the point of attack doing the work? And then morale, right? Presenteeism, turnover, indications that, we're a good company to work for, which ties back to being an employer of choice, et cetera. So kind of a micro details, but in that particular case, the problem we're solving for is a balance, right, across those key metrics, but also for understanding what and can be done differently to improve our performance for all of those measures in a manufacturing setting. So that's a very specific example. But for any organization doing anything, you go back to good business process management principles, right? It starts with people, it's process, it's technologies, and they're very much integrated. And I'll circle back to that here in a bit. But what is it we're solving for? What does good look like? And there's a lot of different ways to define that. For our business, do we want to get faster at the end-to-end process? In other words, our turnaround time to handle a customer request, bring a product to market, respond to a change to a customer order, whatever it may be. Are we looking to drive out cost? Is our mission to bring down the cost because we have an existential threat from our customers saying, look, if you can't reduce your prices by 10%, we're going to go find somebody else. Well, that's a real bellwether for change. Is it the quality of our process results? Do we have way too many defective results in our process? I remember working on, just a quick sidebar story. I remember working with a defined benefits company, right? So basically companies would outsource their retirement plan to this company, the management. And they had two different groups, one in Pennsylvania and another in Iowa, where they had merged two companies to do these services. So they had similar but different processes. So part of the mapping process is I really wanted to understand where the quality results were. And we got to the end of mapping this whole thing out, which I won't describe it, but I had the team go back and say, go through this process and tell me how much of the total time we spend in somebody retires, they request their first payment to actually getting their first check in this entire end-to-end process. How many of those steps are actually some form of review, sign off, verification, or making corrections? Natalie, you want to guess what percentage of the total process with nothing but quality from an effort perspective?
How much?
Want to take a guess? 65%. It blew their minds, which led us to, all these things we're doing down in this process is because we don't have a really robust process early, right? So people are constantly looking for problems and fixing problems throughout the process when we could innovate and design out the source of those quality problems, right? Here's another one. Where and how should we digitize and digitally transform? If we have time, I'll talk about a mapping project I did earlier this year. Tier 1 auto supplier, about to drop a couple of $1 million on product lifecycle management software, additional automation for the whole engineering end-to-end process from do I want to quote it, quoting it, winning the business, all throughout the gates, getting into full production and running at rate, delivering, right, to build cars. Well, what are we going to do now? How do we determine what the true ROI is, which I can tell that story if we have time, of making that $2 million investment against our $25 million annual cost for overhead associated with all those engineering gates? What about the customer experience? Is that the mission? Is that what we're trying to define? Do we need to support digitization and leveraging AI? Maybe that's the mission of, okay, there's 100 things we could automate, but which ones really matter? Be really good outcome of the value stream mapping effort to uncover where we focus in a laser fashion, where to really leverage digitization, leveraging AI in our processes.
You were talking about customer experience, and I wanted to quickly kind of interject here because I think this is a really good place to say that even if you're not in a specific highly technical field, value stream mapping, this traverses into other industries. I think about a historical site that I worked with, and we basically mapped out the customer's entry onto their site through their entire process and then out the door back onto their either tour bus or back to the parking lot to leave. And to your point, we looked at that whole process and we put a smiley face, a straight face, or a sad face through their whole process of where do they actually create customer delight? Where do they disappoint the customer? Where do they, maybe just underwhelm the customer? It's not a good or a bad experience. It's just kind of meh. And looking at that end to end, right? From the time they walk in the door to the time they exit, and even what's the online experience afterwards? Is there follow-up or do we just let them fall through the cracks? And you start to realize that you can use this idea across many different industries to do exactly what you're talking about, which is surface this clarity that leaders can then act on.
Precisely. So at the end of the day, to put a bow on that part is, what are the measured aspects of performance that we want to target? So you got to start with, what are we solving for? And then the next step is, what is the level of granularity and detail that we should have, right? So this is generally going to be driven by the amount of risk associated with making a bad decision. So for example, if airplanes are going to crash because we changed something or we didn't have enough data, then we need to think in a Six Sigma, right? 99.9997% right the first time, only 3 defective results per million opportunities, which, by the way, most aircraft organizations, the Boeing, Boeings and the Lockheeds, you think about them, they're achieving Six Sigma or better with respect to their ability to land an airplane every time, right? The way they need to. It's with redundant systems, a whole bunch of really cool science goes into that. But on the other hand, if making a bad decision isn't necessarily dangerous, we can easily correct it, then just directionally accurate information. I find most of the times we're looking at business processes, we probably don't need Six Sigma precision or depth. We're really looking for probably 80 to 85% confidence that the amount of time the step is taking, its first time quality rate, the amount of cost associated with it, the customer experience associated with it, et cetera. If we're 85% accurate at that level, we're probably good enough to give us a good idea of where to focus, what to fix, and what we can expect to get out of that. For example, let's just say we're looking at that product development process, describe the automotive supplier, many, many months through that cycle, right? So knowing with great precision the delay time for a particular step, one of 500 steps in the process, and knowing that delay time to the seconds is really not helpful, right? Just knowing within an hour or two or three was plenty good enough. And we decided that really the subject matter expert guesses for the hours or days for a given step didn't really need to be precise. It allowed us to get the data we needed to do a Pareto analysis. And what a Pareto analysis is back to that good old 80-20 rule, right? 20% of the problems are 80% of the measured effect. So it allows us to say, okay, it takes, for the sake of an engineering change request, it takes 2 weeks to get an engineering change request through the process, and there's 70 steps, right, across those different functions. We could isolate which 15 of those steps are really 80% of the opportunity from a speed perspective, and then focus our energy and our innovation around those particular steps. Comment there before I move on?
Yeah, I just was curious. So, obviously you've worked with some of these folks that are in high-end manufacturing, obviously people who build cars, things like that. But let's maybe take it to people who run a business where maybe they have not tapped into this stuff yet. What would you say are the places to start? And I think that when you talked about directional accuracy, I think that describes a lot of businesses that I work with where, they're not saving lives per se, or they're not preventing lives from, being harmed by their processes, but they can absolutely get clearer, get better. So let's talk about those types of folks who maybe have not started this journey. Where would you suggest they start? What is the way they could prioritize some of these pieces in their mind?
Generally speaking, you have to go back to that problem state. What are we solving for? Are we trying to grow faster? Are we trying to provide a better customer experience? And you need to create a little context for it.
Mhm.
And once you create the context, then you pick something that you want to chase through your entire process from end to end, be it writing a check for the first defined benefits, hiring somebody, handling a call for a question on your product or service like a contact center.
Mhm.
And generally speaking, you don't want to boil the ocean and try to map everything. And I've had the most success where we say, okay, what's a core end-to-end process
Mhm.
that defines our value delivery to our customers, right? And then we try to pretend we're one of those going through the process. So, Natalie, give me an example of something that comes to mind.
Yeah, so I like what you talked about there. Let's say that we have an HR department, they reach out, they say, "Hey, I need to figure out my hire to retire process. I've heard that there are broken pieces everywhere. It's frustrating for people to deal with. Where do we start?"
Exactly. And then inside of that, you'd have to decide, do I want to look at the entire end-to-end process, or do I want to pick a certain point? Like, for example, an entire end-to-end, hiring manager says, oh, I need to hire somebody, all the way through to having somebody sitting at that desk, trained with access to computer systems and ready to go. That's actually a project I did with the state of Michigan Treasury Department. And it was quite a long, lengthy story there. That was exactly what the scope was. So in that particular case, we went all the way upstream and said, okay, what happens when the hiring manager says, oh, I need to hire somebody, or I need to create a new position in the company? What happens, right? What's the first deliverable? And what's the first functional handoff? So just kind of, I like to do it at that level, kind of with the functional handoff is who does what to start the process. It's a customer order hitting the door. It's the need to hire someone in this particular case. So what do we do? What's the form involved? What's the information they get? Why do they get the information? Okay, great. What happens next? And then you start to map that and capturing artifacts some time, how long it takes, how long it sits in inboxes waiting, how many times do we have to go back and do it over again because we didn't get it right the first time. You start to capture that. But kind of stick at the functional handoff, keep it pretty high level, and just try to walk that out from left to right. Okay. Ideally, you're doing that on a swim lane chart where you basically have a lane for each of the functional parts of the organization.
Mhm.
So you can envision, right? You've got the hiring manager lane, right? Then we have the HR lane for human relations, where all the information, policies and job description stuff. And then we have the management layer, right? These are the folks that have to approve. And then and then you start to, and then you just have these things flowing back and forth. It's called a swim lane chart. And it's a great way to visualize the value stream. And then behind that, you want to get some solid data and just walk that thing out from left to right. Might only take 5 or 10 steps in a pretty simple process, like, a customer order entry process. But a hiring process, particularly in a legislated, highly compliant organization like State of Michigan Treasury, it was amazing. It took, on average, believe it or not, almost 6 months in that process from the time the hiring manager said, oh, I have to hire somebody, to actually having a person in the seat
Wow.
ready to do the work. So you can imagine that was a lot of low-hanging fruit. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely. And I loved that answer because that is exactly what the value stream mapping comes down to, right? Which is swim lanes and roles and resources and kind of what you're pulling on throughout the process. And then I like what you talked about earlier, which is now go back through and look at all the places where you can improve. So first step is current state, then you can start to look at future state. And I have a funny hire to retire story for you, Ron. We did this mapping at a business, and we found out that it was a folder that went from hand to hand to when they were hiring someone. And again, you think about, the risk of, that person's information getting out there. You think about the risk of just losing the folder altogether, someone accidentally taking it home, throwing away. It was actually a really funny way to say, okay, how do we get this folder to stop traveling office to office, and how do we digitize this experience because it's 2025? And so I think that's the beauty of looking at a process is you actually, it starts to become a little funny. You start to laugh at, oh yeah, we can't do that anymore. That makes no sense. And I asked them, it's about 20 people in the room. I said, how many times do you ever lose the folder? Like, all the time. It's like, great. That is a piece of frustration that can now end for every person internally that has to touch this random purple folder that goes from room to room. And so you do get to see a lot of the warts of something, but then you also get to see it improve, and you get to improve people's life. Or, hey, you have this system, but you're not using even 20% of what this system can do for what you're trying to do here. So I love this example because I think it's a very powerful one for people as they're thinking about their own organizations and kind of these hidden inefficiencies that your value stream mapping reveals.
Yeah, I was smiling as you were telling that story about the folders, because one of the projects I worked on is for a state prison system. And the parole and commutation board, right? These are all the people involved with the parole process for whether or not somebody's actually going to get a parole hearing, and the whole thing they went through. And as you can imagine, now it's much different today, but this was years ago. And they had carts filled with folders, and they would basically push these carts from department to department, from function to function, over 3 different floors and, our state capitol. So it was, yeah, it just made me smile. So let's get back to the granularity thing, right? So like the hiring process, kind of a functional handoff, subject matter experts, it's great. But then there's other processes where the micro details do matter. For example, true story, high volume contact center. Who of us has not had to call for tech support at some point, right? And ask for somebody to help us solve when I can't log on or whatever.
Mhm.
In that particular case, the customer, the retailer had outsourced their support for keeping all the computers and servers in stores running across the country. And they basically outsourced it at a flat price. And of course, they outsourced it with a bad process, right? So they had 140 agents on the desk. They had terrible turnover, and the customer came to them and said, if you don't reduce your price 10%, we're going to take our business elsewhere. So they had the existential threat of losing those 140 employees and all that business. So in this particular case, because the amount of time was minutes and the tasks are down to the seconds, right? This high volume contact center, 10, 15,000 calls a day coming in here from across the United States. We had to know those delays right down to the second. This is where the time and motion microprocess mapping made a lot of sense, right? So the speed of the process and the first time quality were crucial. The speed, in terms of how long it took an agent to handle it, directly correlated to the cost, right? So we had to figure out how to basically double the average amount of speed so that the agent time that we are spending to handle these contact requests would come down enough so that we could afford to cut our prices 10% to keep the business. The way we were crazy successful, we basically brought it down 30% pretty quickly, but I won't go into that. So there's microprocess level. There's single function process. Like, for example, let's say you're setting up a piece of equipment and manufacturing, any kind of setup, like setting up to repair a machine or whatever. That requires using a technique called spaghetti diagram. This is where basically you're basically drawing on a piece of paper to scale. You're tracing around every place the people and the things go in the process. And then along with that, you're doing the value stream map. So you're adding a dimension around travel distance, travel time, and other elements, and you're breaking it into what are called internal and external elements, right?
Mm-hmm.
Internal elements are the things you have to do while the equipment is down, not making money for you, right? It's out of commission. So whatever it costs for you or whatever your sales is per hour, that's the value of that asset being down to be changed over, right? So those are internal. And then you have all the external, all the things you would do before you turn off the equipment, all the things you do after. So you're using value stream mapping and spaghetti diagramming to put values to those. And then you're going back to innovate for how can I take everything that's internal and make it external? How can I collapse the amount of lost time associated with the equipment being out of service?
Yeah.
That translates to, good overall first-time quality coming out of the process, the safety of the product. Back to those SQDCMP Toyota metrics. You're kind of back to that. So that's what I call a single function process. Then you've got basic manufacturing mapping. I described that with Toyota. And they would add tack time, inventory, and some other things. They have some pretty nice, visual methods for that. Then there's simple transactional processes. For example, getting a new email set up. I once did a mapping project, like this story. A university, large university, 5,000 employees, right? And the CTO, Chief Technology Officer, was getting a lot of grief from the departments because it was taking a couple of weeks to get a new email set up for somebody they were hiring. They had tons of employees, part-time instructors, blah, blah, blah. And so they're getting a lot of heat. So we did this really quick value stream mapping thing of let's just follow the process. And we determined that there were 17 steps to the process, right? So we got the hiring manager making the request to get an email account set up, all the way down through the sign-offs, the intercampus mail to the IT department, and then the approvals, and finally actually setting up the account. It was 17 steps. And we went through the innovation cycle, and I've used this exact thing as a lab. And basically, I put that in front of the group and say, so if you got to just reinvent this process, how many steps should it be if you eliminate redundant sign-offs, the mistakes, and get out of this campus mail thing? And most teams came down to saying, we could probably get it down to 3 or 4 steps from 17. Just 3 or 4 steps in a day or two at most versus 2 weeks. But then it got even better. I did this same lab with a treasury, right? Same customer. And they looked at me funny and said, it should be 0, no steps. And I looked at them and put, yeah, because we predefine for every single role in the organization, we predefine all the access that role would have that the email is tied to. It's all predefined. So if the hiring manager says, I want to hire people in this role that matches this profile, it's automated completely. So it went to 0 in that case, right? So that's what can be done with simple transactional processes. And then you've got the really complex transactional processes, like processing an engineering change for metal parts that go into automotive assemblies. That's a massive process that can include all the way up into crash testing, right? In other words, I'm changing something in a structural component that's going to affect its crash worthiness. Whoa, look out. This is, crazy. And this is where, you can even take another level, which I did, is how do we take in all the IT touches, right? Because part of our mission, the problem we're solving for is the ROI for investing in more robust tools for product lifecycle management. So lots of pieces to all that. So I'll
Wow.
take a breath here and let you respond to that.
No, that's very powerful. I mean, I think that as we think about holistically, there's so much areas to improve. Oftentimes, right? We're kind of either focused on just, you know, and I think I heard you post something about this recently about just so focused on the efficiencies, right? That sometimes we're not thinking about the innovation. But sometimes there are companies out there that are so focused on innovation that they're not thinking about the efficiencies that they're leaving on the table. So I do think that this is a healthy conversation as we do, hear so much now about AI and automation and how are we moving forward to also say yes, and once we understand our value stream, we can also change some of these places where we're highly inefficient. And I love the fact that we said, no, it goes from 17 steps to 0 steps because the automation components are already there. So I think there's a lot there. I can't believe we're out of time. You bring such a wealth of knowledge every time you come onto the podcast. Where can people find and follow you? You have a podcast. I just joined you over there. Learn more about you and kind of your thought leadership.
Yeah, I'm really easy to find. If you go to MetaExperts.com, you can actually find a way to get on my calendar to talk to me, right? Talk to Ron, and we can set something up in chat. There's, of course, LinkedIn. I'm out there on LinkedIn, Ron Crabtree, and MetaOps, MetaExperts. So I'm easy to find. My phone numbers. I think at least 30,000 people have my cell phone number. So
That's a high number. I wonder if you're on any of the spam texts. I can't stop getting the, political text. I feel like
oh
they could
gosh,
put me on there
why
as a
don't we,
joke.
let's not start that conversation.
Well, awesome. It has been a joy and pleasure to be with you today, Ron. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Remember, don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.
Thank you for joining us for the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Innovation Meets Leadership. And visit our site at innovationmeetsleadership.com for more innovation resources.
Hey, my new book is out, Set It on Fire, The Art of Innovation. Click on the link to learn more. And don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.